When I hear the word Chicago, two questions immediately spring to mind, at least for me. First, what the hell is the song 25 or 6 to 4 about? And second, can the Chicago State men's basketball team ever be any good? Look, I've come to terms with the fact that I will never have an acceptable answer to the first question, no matter how many explanations or how many theories I hear about Chicago's song 25 or 6 to 4. But the answer to the second question just may be yes. I'm Cheyenne Hollis, this is the Touchback, and today we're going to go over why things are finally looking up for the Chicago State Cougars.
25 or 6 to 4.
Northwestern recently beat the, at least then at the time, #1 ranked team in the country, Purdue. However, 2 weeks later, the Wildcats would go on to lose to Chicago State. If we use transitive property, this would mean that Chicago State is the best college basketball team in the country. Of course, we all know it doesn't work like that, but hey, it's still a nice thought. Whatever the case may be, the Cougars' victory over the 25th ranked Northwestern Wildcats was certainly a far cry from the time they got annihilated in 2017, 96-31. The Wildcats actually led that game 55-8 at halftime. 8 may be enough for some, but 8 is definitely not enough when it comes to points scored in a half of college basketball. Look, I know 6 years is an eternity in the world of college basketball, but the fact that Chicago State went from that to actually beating a ranked Northwestern some years later is impressive any way you look at it. What the victory does mean without question is that Chicago State is no longer the worst team in college basketball. I know. That doesn't sound like a lot to you or me, but for the Cougars, who have struggled and fought for 40 seasons, this means everything to them. Seriously, this is a program that has 3 winning seasons in 39 years of D1 basketball, simply competing with a school like Northwestern and its far deeper pockets and resources. It's a massive, massive accomplishment. One of the first videos I ever did here at the Touchback was in 2020 when I just took a deep dive into the history of Chicago State and why they have been so historically terrible. Look, I'll be honest with you, the production quality, not my best work, but if you can overcome that, it is a fascinating look at the sport's perennial cellar dwellers. No team in all of college basketball has come close to matching the haplessness of Chicago State. The team, over its history in D1 basketball, has 291 wins and 833 losses. We are not including this season's record in that total. 833 losses in 39 seasons sounds like a lot, but I want to put this in broader context for you. Kentucky, a school that has been playing college basketball in 1903, some 81 seasons before Chicago State would move up to D1, has accumulated 749 losses. That's right. In 81 more seasons, Kentucky still has 100 or almost 100 fewer losses than Chicago State. I know comparing the best team and the worst team isn't the fairest thing in the world, but it's still interesting nonetheless. The sheer volume of losses doesn't tell the entire story, however. Chicago State has 3 winning seasons over that span and only 11 with 10 wins or more. The majority of any fleeting success Chicago State has had over the years came during the school's first 3 seasons as a D1 school, which were led by Bob Hallenberg. When you take those out of the equation, well, things get somehow, remarkably, even worse. So what exactly are we talking about? Just how bad is it? Well, it's frankly absolutely diabolical. Here we go. Chicago State has had 1 winning season in the past 34 years. On 31 occasions, this is a team that has finished with 19 or more losses. Even at their best, Chicago State has been bad, but not even memorably so. The Cougars have just embraced this low-key level of losing, which is, again, just not a great look. However, with that win against Northwestern and a bunch of other stuff, things are finally turning a corner. When Chicago State hired Gerald Gillian to be head coach at the start of the 2021-2022 season, I don't think anyone thought much of it. In fact, if we're being honest, no one really thinks much of any of the school's coaching hires. Well, apart from when they hired former Chicago Bulls guard Craig Hodges, who had actually just been recently blackballed from the NBA to be their head coach, that was a total disaster, by the way. Then again, every coach goes into any new job thinking they're the one who's going to make a difference, that they're the one who can turn this around. And when it comes to Chicago State, well, the Cougar meat grinder has pulverized them all. Going 7-25 in his first season at the helm made most people think that it was likely going to be more of the same for those Chicago State fighting Cougars. The task at hand for Gillian was not about to become any easier after the end of that first season, because the school was departing the WAC, its conference home, in favor of the nomadic life of a basketball independent. This is actually the Cougars' third separate stint on the Indies, but the situation was far different this time around than their last go in the late 2000s, when there were several other colleges in the same boat as a basketball independent. In 2022, Hartford was the only other college independent, and they were only there as part of their transition down to Division III. This year, Chicago State is the only college basketball independent. Putting together a schedule is no easy feat, since there aren't any teams in a conference that want to play an extra road game during their in-conference season. Like, no school is willingly going to take on excess travel to go play at Chicago State. Despite these obstacles, Chicago State still put in a respectable stint in 2022-2023, winning 11 games, quite the achievement for a program that rarely reaches double-digit win total. That being said, the record looks far better on the surface than in reality. That's because of those 6 wins, 4 came against non-D1 schools and 2 were against Hartford. Ahead of this campaign, Gillian and Chicago State made headlines when twins Matt and Ryan Booley announced they were going to Chicago to play for the Cougars. The former 5-star recruits had actually spent a few years with the Overtime Elite program before deciding that they would like to try their hand in the college ranks. Their decision to join Chicago State had a lot to do with the fact that they were coached by Gillian on the AAU circuit. There was a relationship there, they felt comfortable there, and they just wanted the chance to reconnect with their former head coach. There can be no denying the impact this was going to have on Chicago State. These were by far and away the 2 best recruits to have ever signed with the Cougars in the program's history. It was going to be a game changer, a seismic shift for the Chicago State basketball program, until, of course, the NCAA stepped in. Apparently, the governing body did not take too kindly to the fact the Booley twins were paid by Overtime Elite and ruled ineligible before they ever played a game in college. Talk about being a right, proper buzzkill. The twins have been unable to suit up for Chicago State in any capacity and have instead spent the majority of their time fighting the NCAA in court with no resolution to this saga in sight. While that was a downer, it has not been all bad news for Chicago State this year. In December, the school announced that its athletic programs would be joining the Northeastern Conference, or NEC, in 2024. Even though the NEC has experienced quite a bit of turnover in its members, as realignment just affects all tiers of the college athletic system, this was still very much a welcome sight. This invitation was very important to Chicago State. You know, when the WAC decided to focus on Texas and the Southwest, it really just left Chicago State without a home for any of its sports teams and not many available avenues to find a conference. More importantly, they have not only found a conference and found a home for their athletic programs, but they have found one that actually wants their presence. They found a conference in the NEC that wants to be in the Chicago State business. That is a far cry from their previous attempts to desperately latch on to any old conference that was willing to accept them. since Chicago State got booted from the old Mid-Continent Conference in the mid-2000s. That, by the way, is an absolutely wild story and just part of the reason why Chicago State athletics have been just sort of a dumpster fire historically. There's a great Reddit thread on just sort of what happened to Chicago State and why it was ejected from the Mid-Continent Conference, and I'll link to that in the description below. But basically, long story short, the athletics program had no supervision, and some coaches were just asking random students on campus if they wanted to join a sports team. But back to the present. Being in the NEC offers Chicago State some much needed stability, especially when it comes to scheduling. Take this season for example. The difficulties of being an independent can be seen just by Chicago State's schedule. They are going to spend the final 2 months of their season playing random road games across the USA with a non-D1 home fixture sprinkled in here and there. The program can't even find games beyond mid-February, so while many conferences and many schools are playing on until the last week of February, or some even to March depending on when their conference tournament is, Chicago State is basically done in mid-February. That, of course, is suboptimal. Also suboptimal as a NCAA college basketball independent, well, there's no pathway to getting to March Madness, the big dance, the tournament, whatever you want to call it. There's no way Chicago State is getting there. They could go 30-0, and there's no way they're getting put into the bracket. Of course, that wild hypothetical also assumes that the school would somehow be good and win 20 more games or whatever the case may be, and that has historically never been the case. But still, if they were good for whatever reason, they're likely not going to get into the NCAA tournament as an independent. So being in the NEC at least opens that up as another possibility. All of that brings us back to the upset of 25th ranked Northwestern. Chicago State had never beaten a ranked opponent in the school's history. It had never beaten a Big Ten opponent in the school's history. This was so big for the Cougars. This really feels like a turning point. This feels like the program is on a sustainable upward trajectory after years and decades of essentially walking through the college basketball wilderness. For some reason, one of the images burnished in my brain is a magazine ad from the old Game Pro magazine promoting the upcoming launch of the NCAA Final Four game for PlayStation. I can't actually find the actual ad that I'm talking about here, so you're probably looking at some generic other ads for the NCAA Final Four video game series. But anyway, the one I'm talking about, it featured a bunch of Coppin State, or maybe it was Morgan State, championship banners, hypothetical championship banners for either Coppin State or Morgan State. And the text read something along the lines of, Kentucky, they're good, but they're no Coppin State or Morgan State. It was a genius ad and one that made me go out and buy the game. That's also because I'm a big sucker for college basketball dynasty modes, especially ones on PlayStation around the turn of the century. What I do want to stress though, and the whole point of this is not that, the whole point of this is that I don't think this is a huge inflection point for Chicago State. The Cougars aren't going on some dominant 20-year run that sees them transform into the second coming of Gonzaga. They're not going on a run of 30 straight tournament appearances or just moving up and eventually finding itself in a major conference or anything like that. And that's okay. Simply being a program that can finish with a winning record every once in a while, knock off a big school, and maybe one day find itself as a 16 seed in the NCAA tournament is real progress. It would be a huge turnaround for the perennial doormat Chicago State Cougars. This is why I firmly believe we should celebrate and highlight the fact that Chicago State is not the worst team in college basketball anymore. You know, being school number 315 out of 360, it may not seem much to the average person, but for Chicago State, it is everything. It is hard-earned. Simply getting to this point was a huge uphill struggle for the Cougars. Most of this work, by the way, has gone underappreciated and unseen to most people who follow college basketball. At the end of the day, I don't really know what the future holds for Chicago State basketball. None of us do. Given the transient nature of college basketball, the sport of college basketball as a whole. It's possible for all of this hard work to be undone in an instant. But boy, do I sure hope that's not the case. For the first time in basically ever, things are looking up for the Chicago State Cougars. And you know what? It is a good thing for really all of sports, and proof that any team, no matter how bad they are, can eventually get better. That does it for me. I'm Cheyenne Hollis. This is the Touchback, and as always, hashtag take it out to the 25.
Don't throw it out of bounds. Chicago State with a shot at the buzzer, and it goes! And Chicago State has won it!
Oh my gosh.
Well, we'll probably look at the monitor on this one, but as of right now, I believe the officials have given them the bucket, and now they'll look. And I believe that was good when we were